figure out how to get over to the source. I'll show it to you. Where's that? I'm working on that. We'll get that in a second.
I think the remote's in the nursery.
That's fine.
Well, I got one remote.
He's going to get that figured out. I was getting that situated this morning, which is why we're a little late. And I guess if you didn't know, I should have done this earlier. I heard that a few times on the way over. This should have been done earlier. But we'll try to get it figured out. Make sure that hopefully, as we kind of progress through this, we'll be able to do a little bit better. And again, I think I want you to be able to see this as I go through this as well, just because I think it's good for us. I know my kids learn better when I can show them things. And kind of the same thing with you all. So Romans chapter 1 is where we're going to be. We're going to be starting in verse 18. And we finished up last week talking about the gear that we kind of have mentioned for the last couple of weeks, and how we were part of this commission, how it's responsibility of us as Christians to make sure that we're making sure we're doing what we need to do. And today, what we're going to look at we've finished up last week, Paul talking about not being ashamed of the gospel, the power of the gospel, the importance of the gospel. And today we're going to be looking at how everybody needs the gospel and why everybody needs the gospel. In the end, even the Jews needed to hear the gospel at this point as well. So to kind of start off with, again, the last lesson ended up with the declaration of that gospel. The very next verse here, in verse 17, start with verse 16. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. And he gets to the verse 17, and he uses the word "for." And the word "for" is in there because he is wanting to continue. Paul is wanting to continue his thought. All right. So he goes on and says, "For there is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, that the just shall live by faith." Now, what Paul wants the reader to understand with this verse 17 here, this is kind of a transition verse between the first 16 verses and the rest of the back part of this chapter. He's wanting the reader, he's wanting these Christians, he's wanting the unsaved, he's wanting the Jew, the Gentile, everybody. He's wanting them to know that there is going to be the wrath of God. God has to judge sin. Okay? And that he's wanting the reader to understand that Christ is the only way of salvation from that wrath. It's the only way it can possibly happen. For the rest of sinful humanity, Christ is the only escape from God's wrath. And that transition of verse 17 brings us to verse 18. And then down through the rest of the chapter, we see the importance of the gospel. We've talked about the power of the gospel, how Paul's not ashamed of that gospel, and how he has completely just revolutionized and changed his life. Then he gets to verse 18 at the beginning of this book, and then he gets into why everybody needs the gospel. And that's the first thing that we're going to look at today. Verses 18 down through verse 32, the rest of the chapter. I want us to read those, and then we'll get into how everyone needs the gospel. Verse 18 first. "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imagination, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanliness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who's blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whispers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affections, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasures in them that do them. So Paul here is giving us the opening of this book in Romans, and he's talked about the gospel, and he's talked about the importance of it, he's talked about the life-changing ability of it, and then he gets to verse 18, he goes through this huge monologue here on how essentially every person, everybody needs the gospel, because everyone, first of all, is under the wrath of God. Everyone is under the wrath of God. And God's wrath is different from the wrath He forbids and condemns. God's wrath is a just and holy response to everything that violates His nature. Everything that violates the very perfect nature of God has to be judged, and God's wrath will be poured out on that. The wrath He forbids in people is motivated by sinful attitudes of hatred and sinful attitudes of self-centeredness. And God will and must pour out His wrath on all ungodliness and unrighteousness, as we see in verse 18. So back to verse 18, as Paul is starting this thing here, this writing of the gospel, the importance of it. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all..." Wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and the unrighteousness of men. All of it. The unrighteousness of men refers to the offenses against others. The ungodliness refers to the offenses of men against God. So the offenses that men do against God and the offenses that men have against each other. Okay? Paul is covering it all here when he says the ungodliness and the unrighteousness of men. He makes it clear that every single offense, whether it's against God, whether it's against fellow man or against humanity, it is deserving and has to be judged from God because of God's wrath. Therefore, that means that everyone that sins, everyone that has sinned, everyone that will sin, everybody is under the wrath of God because all have sinned. So, everyone needs the gospel. First of all, everyone is under God's wrath. Secondly, we see in the second part of verse 18 on down through verses 27 is that everyone is ungodly. He goes through a talk here or a writing of explaining the ungodliness of every person. Now, if you think about this for a second, he's writing this book, the book of Romans. He's writing to the Roman Christians, and the Roman Christians were dealing with a whole bunch of persecution during this time. They were also dealing with a bunch of legalistic Jews who hated them and hated the idea of Christ and what the Christians stood for. So he goes through this explanation trying to not necessarily convince, but to explain to all of these readers how they are ungodly. And he goes and talks about what makes a person ungodly. Now, according to Paul, an ungodly person ignores the truth about God, distorts the truth about God, or perverts the truth about God. And we see in verse 18 down through verse 20 here that the first of this, of everyone being ungodly, is the ignorance of the truth, the ignoring of the truth of God. The last part of verse 18, it says, against ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, which we talked about, who hold the truth in unrighteous. Verse 19, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. To ungodly try to suppress, to hold down the reality of God and his becoming wrath of his sin, the ungodly arrogantly and selfishly define their own beliefs so that they can serve their own purpose. The ungodly will describe their own beliefs to help them with their own purpose. The ungodly finds their convictions based on what they feel like she's right or wrong. And they don't base their convictions on what the Scriptures say is right or wrong. And we see this in multitudes in most of the churches today. There's a whole bunch of Christians, professing Christians, who are sitting in churches who have a convoluted idea of what is right or wrong based on how it makes them feel. That's ungodliness. Guys, it's pretty clear. Scriptures is pretty clear. We said last week, right? The gospel is very simple to understand. Scriptures are the idea of what is right and what is wrong is very black and white with God. What God says is right is right. What God says is wrong, and there is no in between. And we as Christians should be following what God says is right or wrong, not what Lance thinks is right or wrong based on the sins that he likes to keep. That's ungodliness. Ignoring the truth, suppressing the truth is selfishly defining our own beliefs to satisfy our own feelings. The ungodly who ignore the truth about God, they deny the fact that God has already revealed his wrath against sin. They even go as far to try to explain away some of the historical instances in which God has dealt his wrath out on sin. Right, one of the famous ones, and you can probably, any Google search you could run in a matter of seconds, you'd have a huge bunch of papers arguing that the flood of the Genesis did not happen. That God did not destroy the world with a worldwide flood. Now, they'll even probably bend and they'll even accept the fact that there was stories about a localized flood that happened that people wrote about. Right? The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the really, really old writings of time, talks about a localized flood. And some of the scholars who don't believe in a worldwide flood will give Christians, well, yeah, it wasn't a worldwide flood, but it did happen locally. Something happened, and we see it in the writings of the ancient people. Ungodly people want to argue away God's historical events in which he has judged sin, because if they accept the fact that God judged the sin with a worldwide flood, then they have to accept the fact that God's going to judge sin in their own lives. And it's easier to say, no, that didn't happen, and know that it's going to happen again, than to accept the fact that it is going to happen entirely. To explain away the historical examples of God's wrath that are recorded in the Bible, there's self-deceiving denial to try to excuse them from experiencing that same wrath. Now, Genesis 6, verses 5, 6, and 7 talks about the wrath of the flood. And it shows, right, the fact that God destroyed the entire world, his creation. He destroyed the whole thing. All right, and what was the reasoning that he destroyed the world with a flood? Why did he do it? Because of what? Sin. So it shows you the extent at which what? If he's willing to destroy his creation in the way that he did because of sin, it's willing to show you the extent that what? How much God hates sin. All right? He created the world perfectly and he destroyed it because of sin. It shows how severely he will judge wicked people for their sin. It shows how severely he will judge ungodly people for their self-deception on thinking that God will not judge sin. It also shows how severely God will deal with Christians who are constantly living in sin. We don't get a free pass to sin because Christ's blood covered it. Now, we have been saved from the eternal wrath. But if we continue to allow that sin to fester in our lives as Christians, not only does it affect our relationship with God, it causes us to be less effective as a Christian. Right? I say that a lot. Right? I'm always talking about being effective in our service of God, being effective in our worship, being effective in our testimony, allowing sin to fester, allowing Christians who continue to act ungodly because they don't want to accept the full total wrath of God's judgment of sin in their own life. They like to come up with their own ideas on things. Those Christians aren't effective. God will deal with those Christians. We can't call ourselves Christians and continue to allow the sins of the world to fester in our life. That causes a great disconnect between us and our Heavenly Father. And God may not deal with it tomorrow, but it will be dealt with because God has to judge sin. Now, we're not going to live eternally in hell because we are saved. Right? Christ's blood has washed away those sins, right? As far as the east is from the west, as His hands are stretched across the cross. That's how the sin has been forgiven of us. But God is not going to allow us to continue to live in sin. He has to judge it. He has to correct us. He has to take us to the woodshed and wear us out a few times. And we can't allow that to continue to be in our... That is ignoring the truth. If we as Christians are doing that, we are ignoring the truth about God's wrath of sin. So we see ignoring the truth about God. Secondly, in verses 21 down to 23, we also see the distorting the truth about God. Look at verse 21. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified Him, not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. So we see everyone is ungodly. First of all, ignoring the truth about God. Secondly, distorting the truth about God. The ungodly ignore what creation reveals about God. But creation's testimony is never silent. In response, some resort to distorting the truth about God to fulfill their desire to recognize a being higher than themselves. And in doing so, they refuse to glorify God for who He is and thank Him for what He has done. Again, verse 21. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Without God as their object, without God as the center of their worship and their trust, they become vain in their own imaginations. Meaning that the reasoning that they come up, the reasoning that they have is futile. There's no explanation of life. There's no explanation of purpose outside of God. And these 3 verses, right, are a direct commentary on the human philosophy that we see today. Remove God from the situation, allow me to be my own master, allow me to reason things on my own way, allow me to find my own path. It's human philosophy as we see it, is it not? We even see this in churches, right? You can Google any YouTube, any pastor or a preacher of a huge church somewhere. It doesn't matter what it is. And not all of them are bad, but most of them have a lot of things that are going on. And we see this same philosophy being taught from pulpits all throughout North America. That God's here for you and He wants you to be successful and He wants you to be wealthy, but you have to find your own way, and there's not really any consequence for sin. As long as you feel okay about it, it's really okay. There's really nothing really wrong with anything. As long as you're happy, God's blessing, and everything's going to be all right. It's the human philosophy. Let me get mine and not worry about anything else, because I'm the only person that matters. And if I'm the only person that matters, then I don't care about God, because He doesn't matter. Distorting the truth about God. Those hearts of those people who reject God, verse 21, it says what? At the end of the verse, and their foolish heart was darkened. They are unable to think, to reason, and react according to the truth. They also become fools, as it says in verse 22. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Anything that asserts the place of God's revelation and anything that proceeds from a rejection of His truth is foolishness. And when you look at verses 21 and 22 again, and the book here that asks the question, it says, name one example of a person, a scientist, philosopher, great thinker, whoever it may be, who claims to be wise but is in fact a fool for rejecting God. The list goes on and on and on and on. And because of their foolishness and because of their rejection of God, we see what happens to them in verse 23. And they changed the glory of an uncorruptible God. And what did they do? What are they doing to it? They changed the glory of an uncorruptible God and changed it into what? To an image made like to a what? To a man? Does it say just a man? No, it doesn't say just a man, right? Paul sticks a little more in there with it with the adjective. What does he say? Not just a man, but a corruptible man. They've taken an incorruptible God who should be honored and reverenced and given glory and thanks for everything He's done in creation. But they have rejected the truth about God. They've changed an incorruptible God and changed it into an image of an incorruptible or of a corruptible man. They've taken the foolish with their foolish heart, with the thing that has rejected the truth of God, and they descend into idolatry. We see the regression here of God's image. First, sinners make Him like man. Then they move from man to birds, to beasts, and then finally down to creeping things. Look at verse 23 again. They change the incorruptible God into an image of a corruptible man. And then they take the man and change it into birds. And then the birds to four-footed beasts. And then finally down to bugs and creeping things of the earth. That is what the ungodly man who rejects the truth about God does to the image of God. Now in a lot of places, especially in America, is what is more important to mankind? Saving an animal that's in a shelter or aborting a baby? Do we see how far we've fallen morally? And you know what it started with? It started with the rejection of the truth about God. And then it escalated when Christians allowed it to happen. We see the distorting the truth about God, how everyone is ungodly. They descend into idolatry. Then we see the regression of this. How is the worship of man and nature? How is the worship of man and nature seen in society today? Secular humanism, the prevalent philosophy of the day that we live in, is essentially the worship of man. Environmentalism elevates, both man and nature to the highest level of importance. Distorted truth about God. Everyone's ungodly. Everyone is ungodly. Everyone needs the gospel. The third thing here is perverting the truth about everyone being ungodly, is perverting the truth about God. We see this in verses 24 through 27. The key word here is actually in verse 24, and it says that, wherefore, what did God do? Also gave them up to uncleanliness. The key word here in verse 24, God also gave them up. Now, this action here does not contradict God's mercy and love. All right, let's make that distinction. God giving them up to these things doesn't contradict His mercy and His love. But if people set themselves on a certain course and then won't turn from it, God's going to allow them to go that way and suffer the consequences. If people abandon God, they abandon their only hope. The immorality we see mentioned here in verse 24, wherefore gave them up to uncleanness, to the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. This description of this immorality here was actually a reference to the temple prostitutes that were very prevalent in idol worship during the time Paul was writing this. Right? They participated. The participants believed that the fertility of their land was based on the frequency of their God's sexual relationships. The pagan worshipers believed that engaging in sexual relations with temple prostitutes in the temple encouraged the gods to engage in sexual activity, therefore then encouraging them to increase the land's fertility and the worshipers' prosperity. That was the idea. Let's go have relations with the temple prostitutes. That will get the gods to have more relations, and then they'll be happy, so they'll increase the fertility of our land and keep our pockets, or kind of help blessings, give us financial blessings as well. And this was happening, this was actually going on in temples in Rome. Okay, this was a thing that was actually taking place. And we think, it's preposterous. How could anybody, really, you can think, how could anybody fall that far from grace? But what perversions and what things do we do? What things do we whore after now that keep us away from God? I can't believe the Romans were doing that, but yet we do the exact same things. Maybe a little differently. Still the same sin. Verse 25, Paul kind of gives some insight here about the transaction that goes on in the mind of a perverted fool. Right? He kind of talks about what's going on, and he talks about kind of the mind, the workings of the mind here of this perverted fool in verse 25. And he starts off with pretty strong language here, right? He says what? This perverted fool, this person who's perverting the truth of God, they take the truth of God, and what have they done to it? Changed it into a lie. They've taken the truth and changed it into a lie. Right? So you change the truth of God into a lie and worship and serve the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And we're coming to that phrase, who is blessed forever, here more in just a second. But he's taken the truth of God and he's completely changed it into a lie. The lie is that the idol will provide the worshiper all that the worshiper expects it to. But in contrast, it says the last part of verse 25 here, that God is the one that is blessed forever, because He does in fact make good on His promises to those who worship Him. So we see the transaction of the mind of the perverted fool here, right? Change the truth of God, change it into the lie. Expects the thing that they are, the creature, expects the creature, the idol worshiper, expects the thing that he is worshiping to give him, to follow through on the blessings, right? The idea here is relations with the prostitute, lands are going to be lots of fruit this time. That's the idea. He expects that to happen instead of following up on the God who has actually will answer promises and has answered promises and will continue to do those things instead of following after that. Revelation 21 here describes the beginning of eternity on the new earth. And don't flip over here. I've kind of got a little description of it here. Those who practice idolatry and believe lies will be in the lake of fire. All right? And that's never to enter into God's new Jerusalem. That's going to happen. Then conversely, God and His Lamb, the Son of God, will enjoy the worship of the nations of the world forever. We see that in Revelation 21, the back half of that chapter, 22 through 26. God will indeed be blessed forever, while those who worship Him will enjoy Him forever. That's the difference of the perverted fool. It's the contrast of what is actually going on and what will go on. Paul goes on here in verses 26 and 27 again to mention the sexual perversions of the fool. And this amazes me that this was written in, like 50, 60, 70 AD. Now we're in 2017 and ain't never been more truth to it. Look at verses 26 and 27.
For this cause God gave them up vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. Paul mentions the sexual perversions here that were going on in verses 26 and 27, but these verses emphasize on the activities that were characterizing everyday life. The very perversions that were going on in the pagan temples were the exact same perversions that were showing up in the pagan homes. And Paul goes on and identifies both lesbianism and homosexuality as perverted practices. Now, today we know that there are efforts, right, to make sure that homosexuality is being socially accepted. But if you look at verse 26, that homosexuality, that perversion, it says that for this cause God gave them up. What does he describe these things as? What's the word he uses? Vile. Vile affections. God calls them vile affections. Now, the teaching of Scripture on this subject, of these perversions, are pretty plain. Right? There is no uncertainty here when God talks about homosexuality. There is no uncertainty. We won't turn to all of them. There's Leviticus 18:22, Deuteronomy 23:17, 1 Corinthians 6:9, 1 Timothy 1:10, Leviticus 20:13. All of these are very clear stating on these perversions. God hates sexual perversion. As a matter of fact, in the Old Testament, under the law, what was the punishment of sexual perversion? Does anybody know? Death. Death. And recent efforts demonstrated the desire for some mainstream homosexuality as a normal, acceptable way of life. And we've seen this, and guys, just in the last 29 teaching. In the last 7 years that I've been teaching, I've seen this really ramp up. Legislation in states to recognize homosexual marriage, to lift the ban of gays serving in the military, the increase of children's literature to present homosexuality as normal, the elevation of gays to levels of stardom in the entertainment world, the condemnation of those people who speak out against homosexuality, the homophobic, transphobic thing you probably hear a lot today or read a lot about that, the teaching of liberal people, and then it doesn't just start with what we see and read on like our TV and internet, right? It's infiltrated our churches. There's liberal pastors who are twisting the Scripture to disprove that God hates the sin of homosexuality. There are churches who are hiring homosexual, openly gay pastors in their pulpits, openly gay women as pastors in their pulpits. Those are things that are happening in churches today. God says those sexual perversions are vile. Therefore, homosexuality is not just an alternate lifestyle or genetic disorder. What it is sin. It's not a change in the DNA. It's not a born this way. It's sin. That's all there is to it. Some seek to distinguish the differences between the desire and the act. Romans 1:27, very clear here, very specific on what also, and likewise also the men leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one towards another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, receiving themselves the recompense of their error, which was meat. And you can consider too here that there is no scriptural basis for the view that some folks are constitutionally / biologically / genetically inclined to talk about or try to use as an okaying for their homosexuality. But in fact, it is sin. The question it asks, and I thought this was a good one. And it says, what does today's mainstream society consider more dishonorable? Practicing an alternative lifestyle or speaking out against it? What is considered to be more dishonorable? Practicing the alternative lifestyle or speaking out against it? Increasingly, right, those who take a stand against homosexuality, transgender, LBGTQPAN, there's another one now too they've added to it. I think there's 8 letters they've thrown on it now. Taking the stand to consider that those things are immoral is considered one of the greatest of sins. But those who are living in those alternative lifestyles are applauded and esteemed and considered to be brave. Let me get off my horse there. Let's move on. Everyone is unrighteous. Verses 28 through 32. And we'll finish up with this. We'll get to the Jews next week. This is the last thing here, verses 28 through 32. Everyone is unrighteous. So we've seen everyone is ungodly. Everyone is under God's wrath. This is all because everyone needs the gospel, of course. Everyone is unrighteous. Romans 18 through 27 here, Paul's case against the ungodly. Verses 18 through 32, he's going to address the unrighteousness of men, or man's sin against fellow man. So we've seen sin against God. That's what this has been. Man's sin against God. See man's sin against his fellow man here. The first one is practicing hatred. Practicing hatred, verses 28 down through 31. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, gave them over to a reprobate mind to do these things which are not convenient. God commands people to show love to others. Right? Matthew 5, 43 through 48. Okay, there's a whole spiel there. Christ talks specifically about the loving, of showing the love of others. Now let me go back to this. I forgot to say this. Back to the homosexuality and the transgenderism and the sin. Guys, there's a lot of people that are like that, and it is okay for us to condemn that sin. It is not okay for us to hate that person because they are living in that sin. Right? I've said this before. Hate the sin, but love the sinner. All right, we're not supposed to agree with what they do, but we are supposed to show them love and are supposed to show them what the gospel is like and show them how Jesus wants them to have a relationship with Him. We're supposed to do that as Christians. Now, it's hard, right? It gets hard sometimes, especially when they're constantly just fighting us, constantly talking and calling us all whatever they want to call us because we're dumb, stupid Christians who have no idea about anything. It's hard, all right? It is, but it's important that we hate the sin, we condemn the sin. We say the sin is wrong, but we still love the sinner and try to show them the love of God. All right? Because let's be honest, those people who are living like that are sinners just like me and you were when God found us. All right? We had our sins that we were doing as well that were keeping us away from God, and somebody showed us that love of God, and somebody loved us despite the fact that we're full of sinfulness, and Christ loved us despite the fact that we were sinful, and He still wanted a relationship with us. Okay, so we're to hate the sin, but to love the sinner. And we see that when Christ talks about practicing the showing of love to others. Now, everyone is unrighteous. Now, a lot of times we don't do that. We see the practicing of this hatred. Now, there's a list of sins here through Romans 28 all the way down through verse 31. And all of these are examples of practicing hatred. Okay, well, let's read these again real quick. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things. And just to kind of make sure that all the bases are covered, right? Disobedient to parents, even he's making sure he gets everybody there. Disobedience to parents as well. Without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affections, implacable and unmerciful. So we see this is a list of hateful actions. Examples of people practicing hatred. God responded to those who reject Him by giving them over again to a reprobate mind. A person with a reprobate mind does what is not convenient or unacceptable according to natural human judgment of right and wrong. And those people are characterized by those following sins. All right? Implacable person, he talks about in verse 30, is a person not easily satisfied or persuaded to change away from his wicked ways. So we see practicing hatred. Those are some of the characteristics of people who do that. And the last one, verse 32, to finish this chapter up, is everyone is unrighteous, practicing hatred, and then applauding hatred as well. For who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death. Not only, we see this again, right? Verse 32. They know that what they're doing is wrong. Right? It says, right? Who knowing the judgment of God, which they commit such things, they understand it's worthy of death. All right. So not only do they continue to do them, what does it say in verse 32? They actually have pleasure in them that do them. So we see the applauding of hatred here. The applauders encourage sin even though they are aware that the punishment of sin is death. And why do they applaud or encourage people to sin? Because those who join the applauders in their sin are not going, if I'm okay, if I'm cheering you on, right, I'm not going to condemn you. If I'm okay with you doing it, if I'm clapping for you and encouraging you to do the same thing, I'm not going to condemn you for doing it. I'm not going to try to tell you why that's wrong. So that's why we see the applauder of hatred. So everyone is ungodly, everyone is unrighteous, and we get to chapter 2 next week, and we'll talk a little bit about the Jewish people, how they needed the gospel as well. This is some pretty heavy stuff here from Paul to start off with Romans. Right, there's not been a whole lot of, hey, God just loves you and He just wants you to be part of the family. There's not a lot of that here yet. All right? Paul's setting the foundation here for these people. Listen, you're worthless. We're all worthless. You need God. This is why you need God. Now let me show you how it is. Okay? And so as we move through this, we'll talk about the Jew and the Gentile more, and then we'll kind of get into this as we move through our study of the book of Romans. Okay? Sin is sin. We all need the gospel. Even us as Christians, we need to remove or eradicate the sin that is keeping us from having a fulfilling relationship with God. All right, that's to give you a snapshot, quick lesson of what we've got today. Everybody needs the gospel. We need to be portraying the gospel. Even the sin in our life is keeping us from being full committed to God, as we should be. All right, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson here we have on Romans, and as we're continuing to move through this and see some of these things that Paul was writing about, Lord, I pray that it infiltrates us in a way that just really wants that puts in us the desire, and not just the desire, a burning desire, to remove the sinful actions in our lives, Lord, that are keeping us from being fully effective in our service for you, Lord. We can't affect the people who are around us who are not saved if we are not fully committed. So I pray, Lord, as we move through this, you bring some things to light in our own eyes as Christians, Lord, that we need to work on, that we need to correct, so that we can draw ourselves closer to you. And if there's people here, Lord, that don't know you, Lord, they see the error of their ways as well. And see the importance of having a relationship with you, Lord. And give us a boldness to take a stand. Now more than ever, Lord, we as Christians need to take a stand. And I pray that you give us that boldness to do it. Lord, I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next hour as well. That you just use him in a mighty way. Lord, keep us attentive, Lord, listening with not just our ears but our hearts, Lord. Focusing on your words you have for us. In your name I pray. Amen.